This kit includes these items: the following tools are needed for this install: begin by securely raising your vehicle at designated spots using a jack or lift to ensure safety during the installation process. Utilize a 21mm socket to remove the lug nuts from the wheels, allowing you to access the suspension components. Employ a trim tool, a 10mm and 14mm socket to carefully remove the ABS, speed sensor, and brake line bracket, ensuring it's disconnected to avoid any damage during the installation. Use a 17mm socket to remove the top sway bar end link nut, then detach the end link from the strut. Utilize a 22mm wrench and socket to remove the lower mount bolts, enabling you to release the strut from assembly. Make sure to keep strut assembly as close to the engine after releasing the strut to avoid the axle from popping out. With a 14mm wrench, remove the top hat bolts. Be prepared for the strut assembly to come out. Securely attach the front strut spacer to the OEM strut using 14mm hardware. Slide the strut assembly back into position and hand tighten the top mount hardware. Place the lower mount bolts to prevent the axle from misalignment. Torque the 14mm top hat nuts to 30 foot-pounds and the 22mm lower mount bolts to 110 foot-pounds. Apply the end link extender with the fold facing down and secure it with a 18mm bolt to 45 foot-pounds. Using a 10 and 14mm socket, reconnect the ABS speed sensor and brake line to its original position. Place the wheels back onto the vehicle and securely fasten them with the 21mm lug nuts to 75 foot-pounds. Insert the wheel covers back on, and congratulations, you have now completed the front install. Utilize a 21mm socket to remove the lug nuts from the wheels, allowing you to access the suspension components. Lift the rear subframe using a jack to support for the installation process. While the subframe is supported, slowly loosen the 4 22mm nuts to lower the rear end evenly to make room for rear subframe spacers. Remove the 2 subframe support mounts with a 12mm socket. Remove the 4 OEM subframe studs with a 10mm socket. Place the 4 rear subframe spacers above the subframe. Install the provided 4 24mm by 160mm subframe spacer studs with 4 30mm washers and 4 62mm washers. Make sure to install 2 subframe support mounts with the 2 rear subframe spacers. Torque the 4 24mm studs evenly to secure the subframe to the vehicle's body to 165 foot-pounds, then torque down the two subframe support 10 mm nut to 45 foot-pounds. Support the bottom of trailing arm and remove the two 19 mm bolts at the end of the trailing arm. Use a jack to support the lower control arm to relieve pressure from rear shock. Remove the top two 17 mm nuts, then the 22 mm lower mount nut and the 19 mm nut next to the 22 mm lower mount nut. Now remove the shock. Mark the 19 mm alignment bolt with a marker to mark current alignment specs, then loosen the 19 mm nut, but do not to remove it. Remove the 14 mm end link bolt. Next, remove the 17 mm lower mount bolt. Slowly and carefully lower the jack to decompress the spring. Secure the trailing arm spacer with two 19 mm bolts, two 23 mm washers and two 20 mm crush washers torqued to 75 foot-pounds. Place the rear shock spacer mount with 50 mm spacer and torque down the 19 mm bolt to 95 foot-pounds and the 22 mm nut to 120 foot-pounds. Place the spring spacer with 16 mm bolt, 49 mm washer and 17 mm nut onto the lower mount. Then place the OEM spring insulator on top of the spring spacer. Place the spring into position, then use the jack to compress the lower mount until you reach the mounting hole for the rear end link. Torque down end link bolt securely to 75 foot-pounds. Continue to compress the lower mount and the spring until you reach the mounting hole for the rear lower mount. Torque to 95 foot-pounds. Insert the rear shock back into place and torque down the 22 mm lower bolt to 120 foot-pounds and the top two 17 mm bolts to 75 foot-pounds. Install wheels with 21 mm lug nuts to 75 foot-pounds to complete rear install. Make sure to let suspension settle for a week before performing an alignment.